Was Sean Diddy Colmes an FBI informant? It's quite the theory, but it's been circulating a bit, and as you look at some of the details of Colmes' current criminal case, is it that far-fetched? We're going to break down some of the origins of this theory and then speak to former FBI Assistant Director Chris Swecker to see if this really has any weight. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. When it comes to Sean Diddy Colmes, there's been a question that has been circulating. Actually, I think it really goes back to a few weeks ago when Colmes was arrested and charged with sex trafficking, racketeering, transportation to engage in prostitution. And this was when Damian Williams, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, held a press conference, and he was asked this question. And it kind of gets you thinking about something.
The indictment describes aggressive, open, violent, hedonistic abuse that you say was recurrent and widely known. Why did it take law enforcement so long to intervene? How many women were victimized by Sean Colmes, and how many others were involved?
Look, our investigation is ongoing. We are committed to bringing justice to everyone who's been victimized by the defendant. I can't tell you why it took so long. I think the better focus is on the fact that we are here today.
Why now? Why is Colmes arrested and charged now? If this was going on for so long, and when I say this, prosecutors allege that Colmes was running a criminal enterprise that engaged in violent crimes like arson, kidnapping, sex trafficking, bribery, obstruction, that he himself engaged in a campaign of abusing women, that this all culminated in coerced, drug-fueled sexual performances with male sex workers. This is known as freak-offs. So if all of this is true, as the government alleges, and this was going on for years, why only now is Colmes being prosecuted? Could it be no one spoke out? Maybe. Could it be that it had to take all of these sexual assault lawsuits to be filed for prosecutors to finally get wind of what was allegedly going on? Maybe. I mean, remember, did we, the everyday people, know about any of these allegations until Cassandra Ventura, Colmes' ex-girlfriend, filed her first bombshell lawsuit against Colmes back in November of 2023, alleging that she was sex trafficked and enslaved by him? That was the first time I ever heard of a freak-off. So was it that? Was it the lawsuits that started all of this? Or, and this is what I want to focus on, is the reason that Sean Colmes was not prosecuted before because maybe he was protected by the government? Is it possible that Sean Diddy Colmes, the rapper, producer, entertainment and music mogul, businessman, multi-millionaire, was he actually an FBI informant? Process that for a second. I want you to stay with me as you process that. So why am I saying this? Well, other than the fact that it's a fair question, again, taking all these allegations as true, why is the government only coming after him now? And of course, Colmes, very connected to influential people in business, entertainment, politics. You would imagine that he could be a useful source of information, right? It's not outside the realm of possibility that you might want someone who has these connections to provide information about alleged illegal operations or any kind of information that might be important for the FBI. You can understand maybe why he would sit in that position, but I didn't come up with this theory myself. No, I want to go back to something that Suge Knight recently said. Yes, Suge Knight, the founder of Death Row Records, longtime rival of Sean Colmes, the former record executive who currently sits behind bars on a 28-year prison sentence for manslaughter. He said something on his podcast, the podcast called Collect Call with Suge Knight, and I want to highlight it. This is what he said a few months ago. Quote, "It's a lot of things that people been knowing, and everybody gets judged differently. It shouldn't be a gray area when it comes to doing something right, doing something positive, or doing something for the community. That being said, naturally, Puffy been an FBI informant forever, as they would say. That's why it's different when it comes to him. Regardless of who gets hurt, all everybody been saying is Puffy, Puffy, Puffy. I think they shouldn't all blame everything on Puffy. His exes in the industry knew about it. Everybody in his crew knew about it. The bees he dates knew about it. Everybody knew about it. So don't push away from it now." So could that be true? Is this maybe just the words of a Combs' rival who's merely speculating? Or, if that is true, then what does that mean for Sean Combs? Was he really an FBI informant? Why prosecute him now? And this is a theory, by the way, that if you go on social media, has gotten some interest. By the way, as we're sorting out what do we really know about Sean Combs, what do we really know about his past, have you thought, how well do I really know the people in my life? Scary thing to think about, right? Well, this is why we have this sponsor, Truthfinder. Awesome service. This may help you out because whether it's new dates, people you meet online, Truthfinder is one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription, you can type in a name and get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone, including their criminal history. Also, within a report, you can look up registered sex offenders that may live in an area too. So if you're interested right now, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. All right, so to sort this theory out and whether it has any legs, I want to bring in Chris Swecker, attorney and former FBI assistant director. So he's going to know best the answer to this question. Chris, so good to see you. Thanks for coming here on Sidebar. Before we even get to Sean Combs, generally speaking, how does it work recruiting and maintaining an FBI informant?
Developing informants and sources is probably one of the most important parts of being an investigator, a federal investigator, an FBI agent in general. And they tell you at the FBI Academy, you're only as good as the information you can develop through, I mean, not just informants, but it's a big part of it because, you know, you can do wiretaps, you can do other types of electronic surveillance, physical surveillance, and that sort of thing. But there's nothing like having someone on the inside who knows the playbook. And that's what an informant is. Now, an informant in the FBI definition is someone who gives information and you have given them a promise of confidentiality, except in certain circumstances. For example, if they commit crimes. A cooperating witness is a different type of source. A cooperating witness is someone who gives you information discreetly, but the understanding is that there's a high likelihood that they will testify at some point at the end of the line when a prosecution takes place. These are two very different things, but they're also both well documented within the FBI. You have to vet the sources, the informants. You have to go through a suitability inquiry for 90 days, which means they're not, it's like a probationary period. And there's a whole bunch of other restrictions around how they operate.
And how does it work getting information from the informant? Do they communicate with the FBI through a secure phone? You meet at a secluded location? Again, this is kind of leading into, if we're talking about Combs as a potential FBI informant, how would somebody meet with the FBI to disclose that information?
Well, there's no one size fits all on that. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on, you know, the situation that informant is in primarily. So some of them, you know, I had informants I could meet in the car at designated locations. We could meet at a hotel at certain times. You could just meet, you know, even at their house, you know, if the circumstances were right for that. But you know, when they're deeply embedded in, say, an organized crime group or a drug cartel or their own criminal enterprise, if you will, you want to be obviously very, very, very discreet. And so that's the way most of the time I operated. You know, I always wanted to meet somewhere out of the way. Sometimes by phone. Sometimes you would give them a burner phone or an email, a dead email Dropbox, that sort of thing. There's any number of methods.
So with that in mind, you heard what Suge Knight had to say. Would it make sense to you to have someone as high profile as Sean Combs be an FBI informant? And I guess the other question is, for what purpose?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if the FBI thought that Sean Combs had the ability to give them information on someone more important than him in the criminal world, and was mixed up in a criminal environment with criminal enterprises that the FBI really wanted to get information on, it's possible that they could open him up as an informant. I have my doubts because this information is coming from an avowed enemy of Combs, not to defend Combs in any way, but I have my doubts that that he would have anything about anybody that was higher up the food chain than himself. Now, it's possible, and it will be well documented, since he is engaged in criminal activity and he's been charged, then it's fair game for the other side, Colmes's side, to get that information out. And what they would do is use it as a defense. Well, the FBI knew what I was doing. The FBI authorized it, which they can do. The FBI can actually authorize criminal activity. It has to be signed off on at the highest levels. I signed off on it from time to time for organized crime informants, for example. But you can't, it can't be violent crimes. There are only certain types of crimes, criminal activity, that you can authorize. So, but I think if it is in fact the truth, I think his because he's facing so much time, the stigma of being an informant is not going to outweigh his need to use that information as a defense.
Let me just amplify that. In other words, you wouldn't have signed off on him sex trafficking people or violently abusing women for years. These are not things that you would have signed off on as long as he's providing incredibly useful information.
Absolutely not. And if in fact they did, that would be, I would say almost criminal negligence on the part of whoever authorized it.
But I guess the question is, and why Suge Knight said this and why you might see the conversation, if the prosecutors are accurate, and this has been going on for years, why is he only being prosecuted now? Is it the possibility that they had no idea this was going on? Is it the possibility that it had to take the people who filed these civil lawsuits for federal prosecutors to see that something was coming forward, that they had cooperating witnesses? Or is it, yeah, we knew exactly what he was up to for so long, we looked a blind eye because he was providing us very useful information? That's, again, becomes a really important question.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly precedents for this, and Epstein comes to mind very quickly, and others, where Hollywood, embedded inside Hollywood, is that understanding that we know what he's doing, but we're not, they're complicit in some ways, they're enablers in many ways. This person is very wealthy, very powerful, and nobody wants to risk going up against that person until a brave victim or victims finally start to come forward, and then there's a cumulative effect to that, where other victims they get encouraged and they get inspired by someone else coming forward, so they begin to come forward, and the investigative agencies begin to really dig because they now have some witnesses and some private attorney has done their work for them.
And look, it's a fair, as some people would look at this conversation and say, this is incredibly ridiculous, this is far-fetched. On the other hand, look, he has access to a lot of high-profile people, business leaders, people in politics. That's why, this question has come up, and whether or not he could provide any useful information. Were there examples, though, where you had an informant, somebody who crossed the line, and at that point it became, even though they're a valuable asset, we have to prosecute them and we have to refer this to other authorities. They've just crossed the line.
Yeah, there are examples of that. I mean, the most high-profile one being Whitey Bulger up in Boston, who was snitching off the Italian mob while he was, actively at the head of the Irish mob in Boston. So, that's a very egregious example. But there are many, many others. That it happens, but it doesn't happen when the agents that are operating, if they're in fact operating someone like this as an informant, if the hierarchy, all the way from the agent through the supervisor to the leadership, are paying attention. In the case of Bulger, they were not. In other cases, they were not. And using informants as a two-edged sword, it can be helpful. It can make cases against very high-level people and organized criminal enterprises, cartels, etc. But when when that informant begins to cross that line, and we have seen it, especially in the Bulger case, where agents want the accolades, they want the gravitas that comes with operating a high-level, top echelon, as we call them, informant. And then they turn their supervisors. They're so productive that they just look the other way. I doubt again, I doubt if Colmes was productive in the context that I just used it, but stranger things have happened.
Let me ask you this. Would we ever know? Would we ever know that he was an FBI informant?
They will protect it, but if he really was an informant, they could protect it for a while. But if this case actually goes to trial, or if it goes down the road towards a prosecution and Colmes does not plead out, then he has every right to bring that information forward because it is exculpatory. It's actually in his favor for him to say, hey, the government authorized my activities, the government knew what I was doing. And if in fact he is a source, he's going to have to out himself. And there's no legal way, and I emphasize the word legal, there's no legal way that the FBI and the Justice Department can protect that. And I'm not saying they won't circle the wagons and try. And if it doesn't go to prosecution, I don't think anybody's going to get it through the Freedom of Information Act, which would be the only other way to do it. It hasn't come out in the civil suits yet. And again, they could subpoena this information in a civil suit. But unless there's a criminal prosecution where he pleads this as a defense, I doubt we'll see whether he was.
Well, before I let you go, real quick, would prosecutors know it? Would there ever be an example where the FBI would keep from prosecutors that this was an FBI informant? Unless, of course, like you said, he comes forward and says, let me tell you what happened. Would there ever be an example where the FBI wouldn't tell federal or state prosecutors about this relationship?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. The FBI would, if it was what we call an informant versus a cooperating witness, they could and would conceal that from a prosecutor. Again, they can't do it legally if it's such an integral part of the crimes that were committed that due process requires that they out that information. But the FBI has withheld that information for prosecutors in the past.
Chris Swecker, what an interesting conversation to have. Let's keep the conversation going as new developments happen in the Sean Colmes case. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much for coming here on Sidebar.
Thank you. Great questions.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.